And welcome everyone to the webinar today. I've hosted a few of these in the past, and so perhaps some of you are familiar with me. My name is David Girardi. I've been with Forma AI for about 3.5 years now, and I'm very pleased to be hosting the session today where we will be talking all about SPIFs. So for many of you, the fiscal year is well underway, and depending on how things have transpired so far, it's possible your organization is considering ways to either get back on track or maybe shifting priorities and have net new objectives. And so, as we all know, one popular way to address these situations is through a SPIF, and they can be really powerful tools to motivate short-term behavior. But, if they're poorly timed, misaligned, or untracked, they can kind of quickly turn into a very costly distraction. But, with the right strategy and structure, they can be a high impact lever to drive behavior. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. I have three panel members, Meredith Noyes of Autodesk, Kayla Thornton of HubSpot, and Nabil Al-Azam of Forma AI. I will shortly ask them to introduce themselves as well. But again, wanted to echo what Britt said, that the chat is open, the Q&A chat specifically. We will try and reserve a little bit of time at the end to answer those questions, but feel free to pepper them in through the conversation, and we will try and address them as well as they come in. And so with that, I'd like to hand it over to Meredith to introduce herself.
Thanks, David. My name is Meredith Noyes. I am the Director of Sales Compensation and Go-to-Market Planning at Autodesk. And I've been here for almost 17 years now. So most of my sales comp knowledge has been in this context. We've gone through a lot of changes at Autodesk over the years, so it feels like I've had exposure to a lot of different business models, leadership strategies, different roles, and so on and so forth. So really happy to be here and to learn from the conversation.
And Kayla?
Hi, everyone. My name is Kayla Thornton. I just joined HubSpot as the Director of Incentive Strategy for Sales and Customer Success. Prior to that, I ran sales compensation design and strategy at Snowflake, and I was at Salesforce prior to that. So I grew up in tech and have had the fortune of working for very established companies, and then also working particularly through Snowflake, watching companies scale throughout their go-to-market and their sales compensation strategy. Super excited about this topic, which can sometimes be polarizing, but I'm very excited to get into it and hear what other folks have to say as well.
Great. And Nabil?
Great, thank you, Dave. Thank you, Kayla and Meredith, for joining. So my background, so I'm founder and CEO of Forma AI. This topic is near and dear to my heart because SPIFs have to, by nature, push organizations to operate quickly and with speed to do it right, and kind of takes that timeline of the annual or semi-annual life cycle of kind of running through planning and bringing it into a very condensed period. So super excited to dive in and have the conversation today on a very timely topic, given this is when we typically see the biggest uptake in the use of SPIFs.
Great. And with that, I wanted to start off with our, the first topic of discussion. So I want to kind of, with the group, define what is a SPIF, because, especially in discussing this event ahead of time, I think internally, we were kind of discussing at certain organizations, you can have something you call a SPIF that is, perhaps always on, or just the parameters around it. It kind of becomes questionable about what are we actually talking about today, and kind of what defines it, and what are the objectives? When do you use a SPIF? And so maybe Kayla, I'll start with yourself to kind of set us up for that discussion.
Sure. So, I think when we think about SPIFs, probably everybody has sort of experienced almost a semantic, different definitions, debates around what exactly a SPIF is. I think in a best practice, a SPIF is used to address a short-term objective to drive a very specific behavior with a very specific outcome in mind. I think a lot of times as a comp person, and I don't, Meredith and other folks have probably felt this before. I just joined HubSpot, and one of the first questions that our wonderful new CSO asked me is, Kayla, what do you think about SPIFs? You know, I feel like they're distracting, they're noisy. I'm not really sure that they drive the right behavior. I don't know. What are your thoughts about that? And so I think, you know, if we were to just pretend all SPIFs were perfectly executed, there is a lot, you know, everybody's been exposed to different sort of SPIF designs. Maybe you've seen a linearity incentive. Maybe you've seen a SPIF around driving new logos or pushing a new product. It's really difficult for any of us on this call to say, hey, here's the types of programs that we've seen work really well, because so much of it ties to your organization's go-to-market strategy. And so when I think about where SPIFs fit into that, right, you'll often hear SPIF should be complementary to your sales compensation plan, not duplicative. So what do we mean by that? When I think about SPIFs and how they fit into this, I consider, right, we as a company, every year during fiscal planning, we establish the company objectives. If we were to categorize those into essentially 3 tiers, your tier 1 objectives are your number one top priority. These are the kinds of metrics for which you want to make sure sellers are carrying quota for. These are, you know, critical to the board, they're critical to the street, like they are, you know, we can't get this wrong. Tier 2 would be things that are also important to your company strategy, but again, secondary in importance relative to your sort of tier 1 primary quoted objectives. So in terms of where we think into, you know, where do incentives fit into sort of secondary tier, these are going to be things that maybe could be commissions only bonus, but they're important enough that you might want to run those throughout the entire duration of the year, right? They are that important that you want to drive that focus for an extended period of time. Then you have that third tier. So these might be things that are very specific to potentially a certain subset of sales, or it could be a transient goal, such as driving linearity in a given time period where there's a specific window to do that. The options are endless. But again, starting with that prioritization of what are your sort of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 objectives, SPIFs are going to fit the nicest. And I generally find we are happiest with their outcome when they fit into that third tier.
Great. And just picking up on that, Kayla, I want to shift it to you, Meredith. And, you know, Kayla mentioned, you know, the time frame, short-term time frame of a SPIF. In your experience, is there an optimal time frame that, you know, we should be running a SPIF for?
I think shorter is better, but I think the exact time frame kind of depends on what the SPIF is trying to drive. I've seen a lot of quarterly SPIFs for roles who have a short sales cycle or for lead generation or building pipeline. Those are great as quarterly or even shorter. I think a longer SPIF for a longer sales cycle also makes sense. So we've seen different versions of that at Autodesk. I totally agree, though, they should be really targeted. The more, you know, the broader the SPIF, the less effective it is, in my experience. It almost at that point becomes a component of the comp plan, to Kayla's point. You know, if it's a multiplier across, you know, a certain product and everyone in the sales org is eligible for that and it's all year long, it's not going to be as effective as something that's short term, targeted to a specific sales team. Those tend to work better. The only other thing I would say about SPIFs is they should, and this may be stating the obvious, but they should be an on top of, as opposed to part of the plan itself. It should be something on top of. So that needs to be taken into consideration as in the budgeting and the costing of the SPIF.
Yeah, I feel like
sorry.
sorry. Yeah, I was gonna say, just jumping on like on the time, on the time frame piece, and because I do agree there's a lot of factors in what you're incentivizing and motivating, and like sales cycle, the type of behavior you're looking to drive, and the length of time it's gonna, you know, require to actually see the outcomes of that behavior shift. At the end of the day, it's, you know, it is also financially tied to the timeline. So it's like the longer the timeline that you're running the SPIF, the bigger of a chunk of money that you need to set aside, which I think we see as a common downfall when you have longer-term SPIFs and you don't allocate enough money, they don't see the results, and then now they're seen as a failure when it's just purely, no different than any kind of component. The minimum threshold wasn't met to be enticing enough.
Yeah, I also think there's a component of eligibility, which is, and this is sometimes a catch-22. Like, I think sometimes the most effective SPIFs are, again, targeted not only to a sales team, but for a sales role within that team. So like the primary sellers as opposed to the whole management chain. But sometimes we get into trouble there. Like, why not me? Why am I not eligible for that as the technical overlay or as the manager? And so all of those are trade-offs, right? The more people you include in the SPIF, the more you're diluting the payout for those people who are really affecting it. So those are all trade-offs that have to be considered in the design.
And one thing I wanted to ask the group as well, there is kind of this discussion out there about SPIFs being used reactively or proactively. So, can it be used in both ways? Can it be used to say, hey, we have something we want to be doing next quarter, let's throw a SPIF out there? Or is it purely, hey, we're a little bit off track, we need to throw something out there next quarter to get back on? I'm just curious in your experiences, does a proactive SPIF become really just a part of the plan? Or is that constituting the definition we're talking about today is also a SPIF?
Yeah, I'll jump in. My gut feeling on that one is that SPIFs kind of by definition are reactive, which I think is why a lot of leadership and sales comp folks kind of struggle with justifying them or making them work. Because if it's proactive, you could argue that, yeah, that should just be built in as part of the comp plan itself. And again, it's not always that way. A lot of times we do proactively a fast start SPIF. But usually it's in response to something really recent. We anticipate quotas are going to be delayed due to some challenge that we're currently facing. And so let's do a SPIF. Like, they just kind of by nature feel like, hey, there's this new problem that's surfaced pretty quickly. And so a SPIF is a quick way that we might address that.
Yeah, I can add a little bit just based on, kind of what I've seen. I do think that, you can still have proactive sort of ancillary objectives or programs that are identified at the beginning of the year where, you're like, no, I don't want to run this all year, but, we want to get off to a fast start, or I want to give this new, product a nice boost. But I think, sometimes and where we run into a slippery slope is when we think about reactive SPIFs. Now, if anything, the last, 5-6 years has taught us sometimes things way out of our control happen. And as, RevOps leaders, along with the rest of the world, we are trying to figure out the best path forward on the fly with the resources that we have. And so, I think we've all probably experienced a lot of SPIFs. Their reactive SPIFs do have some role, right? It also is a wonderful lever to pull if the alternative is replanning people and reestablishing quotas or causing mass-wide disruption, right? That is a huge trade-off that can take the foot off the gas pedal. And even if things are going awry, it's better to give folks a direction to run towards than sort of, kind of throwing your hands up in the air and trying to, waiting to see what happens. And so I still think, there is a role for reactive SPIFs in terms of how, if you were to, do a NPS rating at the end of a SPIF, typically the proactive ones are probably going to be, more successful on paper and have, probably a better, also just, it, gives you the opportunity to prepare better enablement and comm strategy and all of the other features of SPIF design that are sort of critical to a good, successful SPIF. So I think that's the piece that also with the reactive, right? Sometimes these are things where we don't really have the opportunity to, nail down the enablement or the sales plays, or even really, get people prepared to do what we're asking them to do. And so then that also sort of compounds with the fact that, these sort of feel generally rushed and potentially, right, none of us we're really ready to launch them, but we feel like we don't really have another choice. So I think both play a role for different reasons, and typically if you're doing something reactive, in my experience, it's either because there's some other macro variable that none of us could have predicted, or I've seen this as well. There is a deficiency in the go-to-market architecture that has, prevented us from reaching the goals that we had set forth. And so we're hoping that we can kind of throw a Hail Mary SPIF to try to right things in a better direction. But both play an important role. And I certainly wouldn't sit here and say that, one is necessarily better than the other. They're used for different purposes.
I mean, the interesting thing is like, ideally, you're actually doing both a proactive and reactive structure, because to your point earlier, like it's very difficult decision or a big decision to re-plan or re-roll out plans for the entire organization. Or even, minute adjustments to incentives or accelerators, et cetera, are difficult to do mid-year. So in the ideal, in an ideal case, you kind of proactively plan out what are the possible ways that this plan could work or could have faults, and what are the levers that we're going to use as possible levers. And then by that nature, when you actually get to do that SPIF, it is reactive in a sense because you're waiting for the data to tell you the story, to then use that. So it's kind of this combination of proactive framework thinking and then reactive like rollout. I think, yeah, the fault and the kind of the times where it makes it very difficult to see the true ROI or be confident that you're going to get the ROI is when it's truly reactive, it's completely unforeseen, and like there's a push to act on it quickly, which then means you don't do the proper diligence. But just one other thing to call out on the kind of the proactiveness and of SPIFs, like there is the benefit of having incremental incentives that you want to test that are not a part of the comp plan. And I think from like a legal obligations perspective, depending on geos, like the moment you roll something out, now it just becomes that much harder to, pull it back in some cases. And so kind of serving up as like the proactive, incentive for future plan changes is another kind of avenue I think that you can use it in a proactive sense.
Yes, Nabil, I'm so glad you mentioned that. That is a good best practice that we haven't had to do in a while, but definitely something we've done before. People will, you come up with an idea, we want to incent X, Y, or Z. It's like, okay, it's almost like a pilot. Let's start with a SPIF. We get some data around that, and then we can use that data to inform the comp design for the future. It's a really good point. Yeah. Also on the framework piece, here's a plug for Forma. We've built a SPIF framework within the Forma AI tool, so that we are ready to go at any moment. If we want to implement a SPIF, we can go in there and quickly do that. So you're right, it is a balance of sort of, you're going to need to pull that lever, or you may need to, so plan for it in the infrastructure and the design overall, and then wait until you need to, and then you have the levers available. Yeah.
And Nabil brought up one thing. I want to shift the conversation a little bit. So, now that we kind of define what we all consider is a SPIF, this is when we would run it. I want to talk about budgeting, and Nabil specifically mentioned ROI. So I guess in your experience, how do you allocate for these kind of these SPIFs throughout the year? Is it budget that you hold going into every year? Is it, are you modeling or saying we're going to run this SPIF, we expect this outcome, and therefore it's going to, pay for itself in a way? How do you measure ROI and budget? Kind of open it up to the group, anyone who wants to chime in.
Yeah, typically what I, have seen is there will be a commissions budget set aside for SPIFs globally. And then some percentage of that budget will actually go to individual, sales leaders, for example, so that we can, have the ability to fund the global programs with that sort of commissions, global commissions budget. And then, whether it be a theater leader or a specific, part of the sales organization has the ability and the autonomy to launch additional programs with their own, pool of funds. So that's sort of how I've seen the budgets managed. Now, that being said, right, I definitely want to take a really strong, leadership partnership role with those leaders when they want to roll out programs. So, having that governance and that thought leadership in place is really important for, those sort of more team specific SPIFs to be successful. But I think in terms of overall, budgeting, right? Typically, at least in the companies that I've worked at, I usually see just around 5 to 10% of the total commissions budget being utilized for SPIFs. Though that is different at different places, but that usually kind of ensures that you have the ability to run meaningful programs that actually can move the needle and are also, I think, another thing that we try to keep tabs on in terms of budgeting for SPIFs, or at least even a part of the design, both for the cost modeling, but as well as for the impact of the individual payouts, is thinking how big is the reward in any particular SPIF relative to that individual's total variable compensation. So one thing we like to do is just sort of ensure that, just so that, if we're feeling a little bit SPIF happy, right, that we don't want to see more than 25% of someone's commission earnings coming from SPIFs, just because that can be an indication that that's moving focus away from those really important sort of tier 1 objectives. But, curious to hear Meredith's thoughts here as well.
Yeah, we do the same thing. It's sort of a twofold approach. So one, there is that carve out at the global commission budget level. And then a lot of the SPIF requests that we get, though, it's a percentage of revenue approach on the cost modeling. So if, it's a request to run a SPIF, we say, let's look at the revenue expected for that. And then generally they would need to fund, who's ever asking for that SPIF would need to fund it. So most of our, well, I wouldn't say most, we have both. We have the global SPIFs that we kind of plan for at the corporate level, and then we have these SPIF requests, right? And so the cost modeling is similar in both. One's a carve out initially up front, and one is, okay, we didn't plan for that one that you're asking for, so you're going to have to fund that. And that's a percent of revenue approach on that.
I know we spoke about this previously as a group, but this premise of like forcing the organization or those, like, for every SPIF to kind of like set an expectation for outcomes that are going to be driven by that.
Yeah.
I do like the forcing the organization to self-fund it themselves too, for those like truly reactive, the ones that are coming inbound, because you basically are holding them accountable to where do you want to spend that money? Is it some other go-to-market like motion or go-to-market expense, or do you think that truly this is going to drive that behavior? But regardless of whatever those submissions are, collecting kind of an expectation for upside from the organization, and then using that both to track the effectiveness and then the ultimate, having that as kind of the input to the organization to be able to run the financial modeling to basically determine, like, do we actually believe that this is what is going to be driven by that is really important.
Yeah, because then you have, if there's a gap, for example, that they're trying to close, then great, we can go and cost that out, and then we can also measure it at the end. I will say the SPIF requests that we get are really interesting, because it's a window into, at the sometimes the first line manager level, what problems they're facing and how they think a SPIF might help. And very often we find a SPIF isn't going to solve that problem, right? And it's because you start peeling back the onion, and it's a product problem, or it's an enablement problem, or it's some other product problem that a SPIF isn't going to solve. And I think all too often that is the knee-jerk sort of like, let's just throw money at this and that'll fix it. So my team, we love going through that SPIF request process, because again, it just reveals a lot there.
Yep.
And the other thing is a lot of times we can say, rather than a SPIF, do a contest. And that really helps lower the cost, because it's like, okay, reward the top 3 who do what you're looking for, and give them recognition for that at your next all hands, or your next, make a gamification out of it. And that goes a long ways, right? And then, you can give those top 3 or top 5 people, you can give them a cash reward, but you're really, again, focusing your money on a few people rather than a whole SPIF for an entire population. So a lot of goodness has come out of our SPIF request process. At first we were like, oh, we're just inviting a lot of it, but generally we vet them. We learn a lot, and we can reshape them into something more worthwhile for the sales team.
And
So
Meredith, as you were literally talking about that, we had a question come in asking about, when you get a SPIF request, how is it being received? Are you able to elaborate a little bit on that process that you're mentioning? Like, what
yeah,
information are you gathering? Who vets it? How do the approvals
yeah.
work?
The first step was making sure across the board, people knew that all SPIFs had to come through us. And it took a lot of effort to shut down the back channeling that was going on. So once we were able to funnel all requests through us, I mean, that was like 90% of the work. And then from there, it was just coming up with a template that we wanted people to fill out, key questions that we were looking for, namely, like, what's the problem you're trying to solve? What's the return on investment? Like, have them sort of walk through the problem statement and what they think the solution would be. And then sometimes we can just do that over email. It's really straightforward, or it's people that have done it before, and we know they know what they're doing. Other times it's like we need to get on the phone, right? So, and it has shut down a lot of the requests, because a lot of them are a no, or that problem is not going to be solved with a SPIF. So it's just kind of helped streamline the process overall. But yeah, the first and hardest step is making sure everyone knows all SPIFs have to come through a central office.
Yeah, you said something also like that I think is the contests and using leaderboards is just such low-hanging fruit. Like it's cost constraint, it's controllable, and there's something about, there's actually a lot of studies on this that show that non-financial incentives, even if it's financial later, but if it's kind of accrued as like point system. So if you have like multiple leaderboards where like over the year, where you rank on multiple leaderboards gets added up towards a reward at the end of the year, is actually more motivating, because it's not I have 100% of my money here and now I have a SPIF that's 5 to 10%. It's truly seen as a totally different bucket of incentives. From a behavioral psych perspective. So I think there's lots of value in thinking creatively about how you design in SPIFs. It could be dangerous, right? With everything in incentives, like you send a message out, you send a signal out that is indicating what you want the sales team to do. If you over-index, you're detracting from your tier 1 to the discussion we had earlier. So yeah.
In another question for the group, just focusing a little bit on ROI, how do you separate, sometimes SPIFs naturally can end up duplicating what's already in the plan. How do you separate, and maybe Kayla, I can point this to you. How do you separate out kind of the ROI attributed to the SPIF versus what would have happened in the plan regardless?
That's something I think none of us will ever really have the perfect answer for, because that would infer that you had some sort of a control group. And most of us don't approach SPIF design that way. So, there's a lot of confounding variables. And in terms of how you measure ROI, again, sometimes that's ROI shouldn't be looked at as the singular measure of success either, right? You can have a good ROI, but very low participation rate and not made much of a dent in the company level number that you're trying to impact. So I really think you kind of have to triangulate multiple metrics, including what is the sort of company level target that you're looking for, in addition to target participation rates, as well as SPIF ROI and potentially other metrics too, depending on the nature of the program, to really come up with a picture of, was this successful or not? Now, you will never know what the result would have been had you not run the SPIF. Sometimes all of those metrics are across the board poor. There's always the argument that they could have been worse if you didn't run the SPIF. But again, I think that's why, like Meredith said, it's so important to establish what success criteria looks like before the SPIF is ever designed, so that all stakeholders have clear alignment on kind of what the line in the sand is for comparison. And hopefully we see uplift across all of those success criteria. But I think ROI is one of multiple metrics that need to be examined in order to determine whether or not SPIF was successful.
Yeah, and does anyone else have some other kind of those metrics? You mentioned participation rates. What are some other things that people could be monitoring during a SPIF to look at that effectiveness aspect?
I think there's obviously the analytical work comparing against, like if you do run it one year and not the other, or you do run it in one region but not another. But I also just want to throw out the anecdotal feedback. I think is valuable from sales leaders, sales reps, like finance business partners. What are people's perceptions of that SPIF? Is it working or not? We've gotten a lot of good feedback about that. You can always look at the financial metric, but yeah, it's hard to know, was it the SPIF that drove that? Was it the management communication around it? You never really know what drove that result. So I like finding a few trusted kind of advisors within the sales organization to give us that lens as well. It's another triangulation point that I think is helpful.
If you're able to, I agree, it's very difficult to get this perfectly done because most organizations don't have the data structured in the way upstream. But ideally, it is the activity, like what behavior are you driving with that incentive, and then having a very early indicator of this is what we expect. We expect to see more of these types of meetings or activity being conducted with this incentive, or even potentially like a shift of pipeline makeup by customer segment, as an example. And then you're really tracking kind of that expectation on earlier behavior versus looking just at the pure results. And if you have this fully built out and all the data is very clean, which again, for any enterprise this scale, it's difficult to do. But if you do, you have in your intake form that you're talking about, it's like you almost want to ask, like, what is the expected behavior that you're looking to drive, and then like how do you correlate it with the KPIs that you're going to track, and then you can kind of tell well before the end of the SPIF if it's actually driving a meaningful result. But again, very difficult to do. And the other thing that I would say is difficult to do, because in sales comp, I would love the A/B testing concept. Like I think if to Kayla, your point on like control groups, like ideally you can enable a control group. Now, there are ways to do it, but it's not perfect. You could roll out multiple SPIFs and have people auto enroll in the ones that they want. But just by that nature, you're kind of creating a filter, like self-selection, which naturally is going to like alter the A/B test quite a bit. But yeah,
We certainly know when SPIFs don't work. I mean, that's easier to see the impact for sure. And by the way, we see that quite a bit with especially when around product SPIFs, where it's a product that maybe is new or new to the sales team. We will put a SPIF on it to try to get some attention around it, but really, again, it's an enablement issue. It's a maybe a channel issue, and so a SPIF isn't really going to help. So we do see that quite a bit. It's like, okay, we'll put the SPIF on it, but if you see that it's not working, you kind of know that right away that it's not a SPIF problem.
Yeah, and Nabil, I love your comment about really identifying the leading indicators at the inception of the program because, Meredith's talking about product SPIFs, which I think we've all seen every version of that. And one of the things that we found is, in my experience, we're like, hey, like, we should cut this thing. Our commissions team was like, guys, we haven't paid anybody on this. Like, nothing's happening. Should we just shut this down? And there wasn't a clear enough sort of perspective on what those leading indicators should look like. And so what ended up happening is in the background, reps were sort of building up pipeline, so to speak, but the cycle time for them to complete the behavior was actually a lot longer than we anticipated. So that would be a good case to say, no, I get it.
Mhm.
Like it's not looking good right now, but these other leading indicators, like, are they, is there some, buzz with use case tracking or whatever it might look like, right? Where you can say, let's actually pitch. I would like to extend this because my hypothesis is if we run this for another 3 to 6 months, we can actually get some of this to convert. So those leading indicators are the difference between bagging a SPIF and then potentially too early, which will frustrate people because they would have gone through all this effort only to have the SPIF ripped out from under them before they could complete the behavior. So I really like that idea of figuring out not just what are you going to track at the end of the program, but what are those kind of key early indicator metrics to keep tabs on to kind of help us make an informed decision. Should we keep running this or should we pull the ripcord?
Yeah, especially because I mean, SPIFs like on the product like SPIF theme, they're usually in that context done in a way where there is it's novel, it's new, whether it's a new product matter to your point. Like as an example, it's like there's an unknown, and so it's hard to forecast and predict the right timelines, the right behavior or incentive to put in place. So you have to think about it. I just think about SPIFs. A lot of the failure points come when we don't bring best practices for full plan cycle, like as a concept. Like we already know how to do this. You run your planning cycle for the whole year. You have KPIs. You're tracking them on a monthly basis. You're accruing. You're forecasting. It's just done on an annual basis. And so, how do you bring that same methodology down to a much smaller time frame? It means that you can't be looking at SPIFs once a month if it's a 6-week SPIF. You got to be looking at the analytics on a weekly basis to kind of serve the same cadence and best practice that you apply to the full year. And you have to define the KPIs just like for the tier 1 objectives that we have as a business. And there's thousands of people's eyes that are on those metrics. It's how do you kind of bring that back to the SPIF level?
And kind of just piling on, Nabil, what you said, I want to shift the conversation a little bit to the communication, because I think that's something that you were alluding to there. And I want to specifically talk about, in your experience to everyone, what are those best practices that you've seen in terms of communicating to the field? Here is the SPIF, this is how it works. And also, I even want to say, showing results to kind of give that trust that not just trust, but also driving the behavior continually through the SPIF period. Because I think we've probably all seen in our past, SPIF gets rolled out and it's probably, reps are able to see how they're tracking when the SPIF is almost over, right? Or it's even communicated well into the SPIF period. And so just curious, going around the room, maybe Meredith, you're nodding your head, you can start with this one. What do the best practices look like in your experience for rollout?
Best to come from the sales leader, and that can, like, so if it's a global SPIF applying to the whole sales organization, then it should come from the head of sales and then trickle down. But I think it's important to, presumably if it's a global SPIF, then there is a strong strategy behind why we're doing this. And so you want to tie that messaging together, right? I think sales wants to understand the why behind it. They certainly want to understand how it's going to help them achieve quota, or get to club, or get to acceleration and those things. But I think the link back to sales strategy is important. And then again, if it's the lower in the organization the SPIF applies to, like if it's just applying to one team, then again, that whoever the common manager is should own that communication. We always try to supplement and make sure SPIFs are clear in any communication coming from the comp team. That includes in the commission system. We want to make sure SPIFs are highlighted there. So every touch point that salesperson has, they're reminded of the SPIF. Those are some of the best practices I've seen for sure.
How about yourself, Kayla?
Yeah, I mean, just to add on there, I think having really clear like calls to action too in the communication documentation, and just really publicizing and making it very, very clear exactly what it is that you're asking the individual to do. And a lot of times that is a tight partnership with other teams, right? Another thing is, I think, really having a clear sort of triage process around where people should go to help. So like sometimes we're the voice of a program, but we're actually not necessarily the people that are going to be able to help reps. Like, for example, if it's, hey, go find a partner to build an application with. Um, I, I'm not the person that you're going to want to talk to for that SPIF, but I want to make sure that that is really clear, that call to action, who to reach out to and when, immediate next steps to take, and then making sure that those other teams are ready to jump on those support. Sometimes those teams aren't used to getting flooded with questions from the field, so we just want to make sure that they have the resources and are prepared and have a process to manage that. But I think that's another piece, is just making sure that, particularly if it is a new call to action, that there's good cross-functional partnership to ensure that people are able to get off the ground running as quickly as possible.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The execution of the SPIF and the details around, who's eligible, what exact product is it only new for that product? Does it include renewals? All of those details and how it will be administered I totally agree, Kayla, super important to make sure it's planned up front, and then people know how to get information about it. And obviously, like, I think this goes without saying, but because it's true with both the comp plan itself and SPIFs, they need to be simple. But thinking that through up front so that the complexity can be reduced. If it's too complicated for sales, like if they have to submit a case to get the SPIF, or if they have to wait a quarter to be paid out, because of like those things are just gonna dilute the effectiveness. So you got to make it simple enough that people can execute easily on it.
Yeah. I saw a comment or a Q&A of like how SPIFs are implemented, whether it's manual or systematic. And this goes back to an earlier point that I believe, I don't remember who, but somebody touched on, which is around the ability to track progression. So what's really tricky is if you are using data that needs to be tracked manually, it's really hard to expose that data to reps in any sort of systematic dashboard that will allow them to see how they're tracking against performance. And then, that becomes super demotivating in and of itself, even if everything else in the SPIF design is perfect, because, it's like, no one wants to just walk into a black box and go through. It's like, hey, if I'm going to take all this time out of my day and do this additional effort, I want to see how I'm doing, right? No one wants to go into a performance review completely blind with no idea how they're doing. So I think that's another, really important consideration wherever at all possible, avoiding use of, manual tracking. The other thing is manual tracking, like all comp data, is rife for error. And that can be a huge morale buster if, there's a, mistake in the data or the calculations or what have you. We can really erode rep trust quickly if we don't have good data quality, which is just more of an issue typically with manual data sources.
I mean, this goes back to like what I know we touched on this, previous discussion, but like what level, and you touched on this, Meredith, too, is like what level are you applying the SPIF? Are you doing a global SPIF? That's a very, it has to be systematic. I think it has to be like completely integrated into the normal communication streams, etc. And driven from the top. But there is value in like kind of that, I would say like the qualitative or like on the, um, on the sales floor, like knowledge that doesn't exist necessarily in the data initially, where you can empower your first line managers or second line managers with a certain budget and give them the autonomy of kind of like you can throw out incentives or SPIFs that are constrained to these three types, a max of X amount, like kind of build a framework around it and then enable them to kind of have very targeted. That there is a danger, obviously, with any sort of like MBO or like incentive like structure like that, is that everyone just gets 100% and that basically just becomes tied to their base comp. But if you can enforce it and you kind of like hold them accountable to certain pay distributions and things like that, I think those hard to measure or the manual to measure, where you can get some of that qualitative feedback from the sales manager, might be a useful tactic in certain cases. So.
Yeah, I think my thought on that, Nabil, is like my first thought is making sure it would be I love the idea. I'm gonna be like the negative one, but it would be difficult to manage to make sure, because again, what I see with these SPIF requests is like sometimes they're just, they're distracting, they're gonna take people away from, again, those tier one objectives, or they're not strategically thought out. Like yeah,
Yep.
I
Yep.
hear you. I think it would be interesting to do that and then try to see what results we would get from it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the concept would be like if you could couple it to enforce them to like couple it to specific opportunities. So it's kind of like
Yeah.
opportunity level bounties that the managers kind of are in control in their, and if you think about kind of the forecasting and of sales, like it always comes, it's like a bottom up, top down discussion, but you're kind of aggregating information, you're relying on sales management to kind of feed the forecast for the next quarter, and then the year. And I think if you can actually give them a lever to like allocate those bounties, and it has to be systematic. This is where it's like kind of like you have to put constraints and a process around it. But if you can get to that level, there's just so many nuances that the data is not picking up. Like, the sales manager is going to know, like, I really don't want you focusing on this opportunity. It's just not going to go anywhere this quarter. So like every time you're banking on this for a seller, it's like there's a danger versus, go prioritize these ones. Which is very difficult to do systematically across the board with even the top line comp plans. But.
Yeah.
Well, I think, we covered certainly a lot of topics. We're coming to around, just the end of the hour here. I wanted to look at a few of the questions that have come in and pose them to you guys. And so I'm gonna try and go through these. There's a couple that I want to link together. There's one specifically asking about how often SPIF should be proposed through the year, so it's not too much to killing the momentum. And I kind of want to tie that to essentially there's another question about having a set dollar amount per quarter allocated to SPIFs. We will always pay that amount regardless of good or bad sales quarters. Curious, what are the pros and cons to this approach? So like, in your experiences, does this happen often, where you have a SPIF every single quarter? Is that bad? Is that too much? Is it overloading? What have you guys seen in the past?
Definitely. We've had some sales contests that have run actually multiple years, or even some SPIFs. More likely though, it's a contest that will run multiple years. And at some point it's run its course, right? And on a true, and that's kind of the contest one. On a true SPIF, again, going back to this top of the hour, I think the short-term SPIF is going to be more effective. If it's long and if it's recurring, I think there becomes an entitlement, and then you may as well just bake it into the plan. It's kind of lost a little bit of the essence of being a SPIF if it's recurring and too often. That would be my feeling about that.
And what about the kind of second part of the question around, always paying out a set amount? So I'm guessing in this kind of question, it's probably a forced rank type SPIF where maybe the top performers get a certain set dollar amount. Is that your experience in what you guys have done in the past, or is it typically, again, commission accelerators and so forth? Like, is there any cons to always paying out the SPIF budget in full every quarter?
Kayla, have you done that? We haven't done that, so I can't really speak to that. I would think, again, that would become an entitlement and not necessarily tie to direct behavior. But yeah, Kayla, go ahead. I don't know if you've done that.
I mean, it really depends on the SPIF design. I've seen SPIFs that where we actually gave like amplified quota retirement, which at that point arguably isn't a SPIF anymore. We've also done accelerated commission rates. We've done flat dollar payouts. I'd say, depending on the audience of the SPIF, one thing that we like to kind of keep tabs on is the range of OTEs within a given group if you're going to do like a flat dollar payout. Just simply because, $1,000 might be super compelling for some like a, early career SMB rep, but it's meaningless to a super tenured, upmarket, diehard enterprise rep. So I think that's like one thing where, if you're traversing folks that are coming from, different segments, potentially different OTE ranges, the flat dollar payout can be a little bit of a tricky way, and there's other ways to kind of scale payouts if that's the case. But yeah, in terms of other structures, I mean, you can be very creative. The other thing is like I have also distributed equity for SPIFs if part of the objective was retention play. So there's lots of ways to do this, but I would say just thinking about your audience and how compelling whatever the amount is going to be for that audience.
I mean, I think the premise of like how frequently can you roll out the SPIFs as well, like this kind of ties back to the sales process length and that segment that you're going after from a sales process. Like if you're going after SMB, true, like the smallest businesses, sales cycles deals can be closed within the first call or first sales meeting. I mean, sure, in theory, you could actually change your incentive plans once a week or once every other week, and it's actually relatively fine. Maybe 2 weeks is a bit crazy, but like, yeah, the timelines of that person kind of building up their pipeline and shifting behaviors to set themselves up for success are much, narrower like band. And so you can actually be far more iterative. I mean, we even see like entire comp plan shifts once a quarter in organizations that are operating that model. You then go to enterprise sales motion, the things that you're doing today are impacting that territory 18, 24 months from now. I mean, the more frequently you're kind of throwing out SPIFs, the danger is you're constantly, ideally, and you mentioned this in one of our previous discussions, Meredith, like the complementary versus kind of distraction, right? And having SPIFs be complementary. I mean, like if they're complementary, then it's okay. You can roll them out potentially more frequent but it's hard to do that many SPIFs very frequently that are all complementary to the overall goal. So then you just take a risk of like the more frequent you do SPIFs in a much longer timeline sales cycle, the more you're taking risk of distraction, which may have short-term maybe wins, but long-term consequences towards those tier one objectives that we have.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and if you think about like, how many things people are managing in their brains, right? Let's pretend they have, 2 quota metrics, and then maybe they have 2 secondary, additional permanent commission opportunities, and now there's 3 SPIFs, right? That's 7 things that somebody is thinking about at any given time, and they will have to force rank that prioritization in terms of how they spend their time. And I think we just have to really understand that whatever it is that people retire quota for would and should always take precedent over everything else. So if you start getting really SPIF happy and you've got, I say like 2 to 3 max per role in any given time frame, right? People just cannot focus. And again, we don't want them to
Yeah.
be focusing on too much because it's just too many things to manage in their day to day. But yeah, I mean, when you think about what, all of the objectives all up that an individual seller has to keep track of, you can quickly see where there's just so much more value in doing a really like 1 or 2 super punchy, meaningful SPIFs, and then, leaving it alone. Because again, if your desire is to, sort of pay people more for the same behaviors, or, you're coming up a little light in terms of like commissions budget, right? If you're like behind in terms of where you would be forecasted to spend commissions budget, just simply layering on more things that people have to think about is not usually going to end up driving the kind of results that you'd like to see.
Great. And we have 2 more quick questions I want to try and cover in the next couple of minutes. So one of them is related to maintaining enthusiasm throughout the SPIF cycle. So how do you maintain that enthusiasm to keep the lowest and highest performers engaged? I don't know if the answer is really just in the S of SPIF, meaning short.
Yes, short, but also those leaderboards, highlighting the winners frequently, and making sure that's visible for everybody. Yeah.
Yeah, great. And sorry, in terms of another great question, a rule of thumb, is there a rule of thumb to determine what is a compelling amount for a SPIF? So Kayla, you mentioned the $1,000 being not so compelling perhaps for certain people. You also mentioned earlier in the conversation the 5 to 10% budget. Do you extend that to the rule of thumb for, should it be around 5 to 10% of OTE in terms of what we should throw out there for a rep to be interested?
I never like to see people making more than 20, like my like hit the brakes metric is no more than 25% of someone's commissions coming from SPIFs. That's important to me. But I do think that in order to, think about how to structure the amount of the payout, I like to think about what that person's relative variable compensation is. And if you are targeting a segment where there is relative parity in the variable amount, then having sort of these uniform dollar amounts can work really well. If you're traversing across folks that have pretty different variable ranges, I've done things in the past where we've framed the reward as a percentage of TI. So like, hey, go do this thing and you'll get like whatever the equivalent is of 1% of your TI. That way it can scale, for a wide audience without having to kind of like back into an exact number and make it super complicated to communicate.
Yeah, I think usually like this, a very simple way to put a kind of a guideline is like 1 to 2% of total on target earnings per week. And then you can kind of usually see that cap out and being impactful even on a quarterly basis once you get to like the 5 to 10%. If you're doing like a really big meaty, SPIF at a quarterly level, but like just to have enough juice relative to the amount that they're earning on a weekly basis. So.
Right. Well, everyone, we're at the top of the hour, so thank you so much for your contributions today, Kayla, Meredith, and Nabil. And thank you to everyone who was listening. And we hope to see you at our next webinar in the future. So have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Kayla. Thank you, Meredith. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.
Bye.